It gives me great pleasure to say that our next review is Grave Pleasures and Plagueboys. What else are we after the pandemic? 6 years, which I have felt every day of, let me tell you, since the release of their last album, Motherblood, which, when it came out, was one of the most well-received albums kind of among the TNM audience. So I'm sincerely hoping that everyone who was there for Motherblood will show up again for this. And anyone who's come on board with us since then, we'll give this a shot. We've got a new album from Grave Pleasures. Their third or fourth, if you count the album from when they were Beast Milk, which we recently did an album club on as one of the kind of great debuts of the 21st century. Because of this, I'm hoping I don't have to do too much of an intro spiel here. If you are an active listener of this podcast, you will have heard Grave Pleasures be mentioned countless times. But 6 years since a release means that they have been absent, and they were nowhere near big enough for that kind of legend to carry through them, that absence, without the need for some kind of reintroduction when they come back. Guys, thoughts on Grave Pleasures?
Really good goth rock in it. Like they're like, everything we kind of talked about when we did the Beast Milk thing on the album club. They just are one of the coolest sounding bands around.
Yeah, I've not stopped listening to Climax since we did it on Album Club, and it really took me from a state of kind of passive enthusiasm for Grave Pleasures to something much more active. I was like really excited for this, like in the wake of the Album Club.
I mean, it's a good job you haven't stopped listening to that because of what we got coming up next week. But like, I have been saying for the last couple of years that this was my most anticipated album. Grave Pleasures for me are in the like elite of the elite when it comes to bands I consider to be the best in the world right now. Where for me, this is like of equal significance to like, I know, a new Code Orange record coming along or a new Creeper album or something like that. Motherblood in particular is an album that is incredibly close to me. It's probably the album I've listened to the most overall in like the last half a decade. So I had built this one up an awful lot. This is the best band in the world when it comes to modern day post-punk. They were ahead of the curve on that even being a thing, as we discussed in our Beast Milk episode. It's players with a bunch of pedigree in all sorts of genres like extreme metal, punk rock, prog, who united all kinds of tribes of people when they emerged. But today, every time we talk about them, I do feel conscious of the fact that I am shouting about this band that the rest of the world seems to kind of largely ignore or have moved past. But if you like gothic post-punk, if you like world-beating melodies on rock songs you can dance to, they've always had this kind of like dancing through the end of the world, through death and nuclear annihilation thing to them. And here, they're, of course, like Enter Shikari, coming out of a pandemic and factoring how to kind of reckon that into coming back to things. I'll let you guys go first. Do you like this record? Are you in on the Plagueboys?
Yeah, of course I like this record. How can, like, when it's beginning with like, she's the end of the world in the fall, like all that, like existential disintegration, like it's the coolest sound. That is just all I can really say about them. Like, no band sounds as cool as Grave Pleasures. Everything from like the guitar lines, the bass. Yeah, it's the post-punk, but it's not, when everyone thinks of modern post-punk now, they just think of, I'm gonna shout over a bass line. Like, that is what people think, isn't it, when they hear modern post-punk? And that's not what Grave Pleasures are, because it is there, but they've got the whole like new wave, goth rock thing, and they just sound so effortlessly classy. They rock, but it's super danceable. Vocal melodies, like, even though it's like a really like downcast, like quite dreary sort of like baritone vocal melody, so infectious, so catchy, just amazing band. Like,
yeah, I went back to Dream Crash after we did Climax, and while I think that record is very good, it definitely feels like the weak link in the chain. So there was a part of me that I couldn't be sure that like this record was going to be.
I mean, you heard Motherblood, right? Or... Like, Motherblood came after Dream Crash, and everyone loved that one.
Yeah. No, that's true. But I mean, yeah, no, this is fucking great because they have an instantly recognisable sound. They're one of the sort of few bands to have emerged in the last few years that I think that's really true of. And this album doesn't scrimp on that. It's just so cool after 6 years to hear them come back with that sound, but also playing with some new colours and it all working.
Yeah, when High on Annihilation came out as the third single from this record, this was one of the rare albums where I was like actively listening to every single single that came out because I was just so excited for it. I was talking to one of my mates who was a fan of this band, and he was like, "This is a bit saucy, isn't it, with that song?" And I've not been able to stop thinking about that because the production on this album has the most colour and the most kind of pop of anything they've done, where High on Annihilation, the riff starts very Grave Pleasures, right? But then, like, in a Grave Pleasure song before, you'd just get like two, snare hits or something and you'd be off in this kind of punk song. You suddenly get this huge pulsing drum machine, and it fucking lights the place up with how dramatic and like deliberately outlandish those drum sounds are there. And then you're whirring through the mix, like kind of, ooh, whoa, can you get over that? And I think it's really great of them to introduce something new like that to the sound at this point in time, because the last album just kind of fully nailed, like, this is what Grave Pleasures is. This album kind of sounds like the most slaved over of the Grave Pleasures or Beast Melt albums to date. Not the most spontaneous or energetic, the most like get in a room, switch on your amps and go, but the most patient. And I think that's rewarded, because something like that and the detail there sounds classic to me. Like, this record has pop songs like The Cure wrote, like Echo and the Bunnymen, even a bit of Depeche Mode there for maybe one of the earlier times for Grave Pleasures. They are beautifully melancholic and emotive, and they have real depth, but not at the expense of the actual pop and the drive of it. And they thread that needle time and time again on this record.
Yeah, I think right, because as Ellis said, they have got such a distinct trademark sound, but this one feels like they have really fine-tuned every little deal. Whereas like Motherblood, I think, does have a bit more of that kind of plug in and play, kind of like rollicking thing to it.
Motherblood was like the sequel to the Beast Milk record in that regard. But
Totally. Whereas this is, you're like really fine-tuned, and every little detail has just been like worked over, but without it sounding inorganic at any point. Like, I don't think you can say that about them at any moment, even though this is a like really sort of high fidelity, like polished record.
The electronics on this record sound more human than the band on Bury Tomorrow.
I don't agree on that, but but no, you're right. But the electronics, they don't. Again, they sound really. Classy was the word I'm going to go for when I sort of say the sound of this band.
I think it's one of the big things that distinguishes them from, again, when you say post-punk and you think of Idols and the like, there's not that delicate touch that this kind of has. Yeah.
Well, no, and on this record, it's not just post-punk. There's large sections which are more new wave, which is kind of a close relative of post-punk. But like, listening to this, I thought, like, I've never heard the Talking Heads in Grave Pleasures before, but the way that band have these kind of, you wouldn't say funk, but these kind of light-footed textures, I'd not heard, and I didn't think it would be possible for Grave Pleasures to implement that. Been like Heart Like a Slaughterhouse, that really evokes that. And another thing that, again, they've kind of hinted at before, but they kind of go two-footed on a few of the songs here, is krautrock, which again influenced a lot of the post-punk bands around that time, like Killing Joke, Dead Can Dance, that sort of thing. But they've never referenced it so explicitly, and it's a sound that not that many bands nowadays draw upon so directly, but it really suits them.
I think these extra touches are a natural kind of extrapolation of what was going on more kind of scrappily in Grave Pleasures before, because like they've, since the Beast Milk days, they have always been the rock band who makes songs you can actually dance to the most. And you get like Imminent Collapse on this, and it is fucking immaculate. It is so fucking good, that in terms of the guitar sounds and the reverb and how they all sound like around you, the dance beat on the drums at the core of it, like moving it forward, the vocal line that is just so like enveloping and let you lose yourself in it, that the world is on its hinges, somehow you pull me back. Like, it convincingly sounds like a kind of haze of, enchantment, seduction, kind of losing yourself in a sensation. And so many bands want to evoke that, but to actually do it as effortlessly as it kind of comes to Grave Pleasures here on that is really something. The hardest stuff on it, because they are like a jagged edged punk band at the core, it comes through on something like Disintegration Girl at the start, which, I mean, this band are recognisable from just their drum patterns. Like, they don't get enough credit for that, but you know how hard that is? Like, that locked-in kind of militaristic tom part, and then the clap beat comes in, and it still sounds kind of eerie and intense when they're doing it. Like, even when the drum machine is popping off on High on Annihilation, the accents where it puts stuff, like, still sounds like a trademark Grave Pleasures kind of drum beat. But as you were saying, like, that's like this punk song, she's the end of the world in the form of a girl. It's just falling for an atom bomb again, but fuck it.
Literally,
kind of when the pre-chorus does that the second time, before the melody like just lifts off into those higher registers. Like, this band just let that stuff fly right now, like few others.
It is such a good way to begin, because it immediately pulls me into the record, and I'm kind of just like, that's it. I'm in the gloom, but I'm dancing around and just having fun. And like I say, the seductive sort of guitar leads, how moody the bass line is. It is so immediately distinct to them, and you're right, like the drumming, everything, you just go, this is the sound of Grave Pleasures. And like, whilst they're like post-punk, a lot of bands are doing it, no one is just no one sounds like Grave Pleasures when they hit it. Like,
yeah, I mean those extra bits of color and so on in the mix, like Society of Spectres as the lead single now looks like something of a bridge, I guess, for the whole record, because those like big swaggering organ sounds are so fresh and like ear catching for them, you know, channeling kind of poppier bits of Killing Joke and the Chameleons and those kind of influences. But then the punk guitars just like smack you in the face for the chorus.
It's one of the
it's like being
songs
hit
where,
by
like,
a brick wall.
well, the guitars properly crunch, because again, like the guitars like don't always crunch us, but they're always like really infectious. But that's when we're like on that bridge, they properly go, and it makes it a nice kind of change where you've got this hard hitting guitar part on a record where again it just keeps you on your toes, where you know that Grave Pleasures can switch into any lane when they want to.
Yeah, and I mean that tune in particular for me, like the way it kind of has a really sparse arrangement at the beginning, but then it explodes into that hyper vivid psychedelic atom bomb of a chorus. It's just like, you know, after 6 years away, they've not lost one step of it, and I think that's why Disintegration is a really smart opener, because you know we'll all have said it now, but The End of the World in the Form of a Girl is like, it's such a typical Grave Pleasures hook, but
bordering on self-parody.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that if that came later in the record, you might go, come on, fellas. But the first song you hear on the new record 6 years later, it's like that sort of comfort blanket before you go on this sort of adventure into different styles and different moods.
Yeah, and what you were saying about kind of when the guitars like smack into you on Society of Spectres, the fact that this record that is slightly more patient for them still has that real like proper plug in and play energy on something like that.
It reminds you that they are a punk band.
Yeah, exactly.
At their core, like,
which, considering it's open with the keyboards and everything, like early frontrunner for Song of the Year. Like everything about that song makes me want to fucking punch the air. Like the way it is so slinky and so cool. I think the only band who can manage this level of like slick is Queens of the Stone Age at their very best. And then it like clenches that fist for that hack and slash chords, and it's just so electric. And you know, the shadowy political imagery in there with, you know, you fallen in with banshees, you were throwing votes to Holy Ghost, like has not been a more addictive song for me this year on that like really heavy front, but while still maintaining that kind of like constant beat. Heart Like a Slaughterhouse, which you mentioned, Elliot, is one of the like maybe the darkest, heaviest Grave Pleasure songs in mood. But even when that riff comes in, it's so like angular and kind of uncomfortable. It's got this propulsion to it and this like pounding constant snare that just makes you want to move. And that like main riff, you've got to remember the guitarist in this band is one of the main guys in a Rancy Pazuzu, and the way those kind of like strange dissonant ideas get warped into like a coherent structured groove here, done on like a much more fiercely like tight disciplined kind of level, and it's great invention, and the result is that song is like hypnotic, even though with the hook it doesn't have to move into that kind of higher register or anything, but just the enunciation of it in the hard like a slaughterhouse, like it's so locked in.
Yeah, that song for me was one of the ones that really evoked the krautrock thing, because when the sort of drums kick it off at the beginning, you think it's gonna go into something a bit more 4/4 and, you know, relatable even, but that jagged, awkward riff and the way it so quickly puts you off base, and that like Lou Reed kind of vocal performance, it's not a natural earworm, I don't think, but it's so lodged in my head now. Like that for me is one of the highlights on the record, even if it's one of the least maybe atmospherically like sort of definitive of what Grave Pleasures usually do, but it's just such a cool thing to go into. Like on the second track, start evoking bands like Velvet Underground and Suicide. It's like, yeah, that's one of the absolute highlights for me.
Yeah, like I get like that song, like the backing vocals. I think that's what adds kind of the atmosphere and makes it immersive. Like it's just saying, like that's one of the highlights. Like you could pick pretty much any song on this. I think every song has like, again, whilst it's so distinct to the sound, has a clear identity. Like, I think like when the shooting's done, that makes Gloom sound so infectious, and when it's just drilling in that main hook over that real like danceable beat,
the bit like, the keyboards come in and they're like, when the shooting's done, do 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 do. Again, that's kind of like, ooh, bit more color in the mix this time around from you guys.
But it just keeps it really fun and danceable, and you just, no one's doing that. And then you go straight to High on Annihilation, and you get that float with the fancy of One Last Goodbye. Like it's just such a like engaging, like cool, just immersive record.
Yeah, like talking about cool lyrics when we did the Beast Milk album club, that whole chorus in, you know, too much blood to ever clean out, heart like a slaughterhouse. He says at one point in High on Annihilation that he's jealous of skeletons. Like, I swear on this album, Matt has somehow gotten more dramatic. Like,
it's the cuts like a heavenly knife on Conspiracy of Love. That's one that really stuck out to me. I was like,
the falsetto that he does in Disintegration Girl or High Annihilation, and then particularly when I heard Heart Like a Slaughterhouse the first time when it was the single, he does that, like, again, full on almost self-parody moment of desperately intimate, and like that weird post-punk vocalist utteration thing. It rides such a line of like preposterousness, but kind of works it. Where
it's because there's conviction. He's not embarrassed to be doing silly vocal lines.
I need one of these songs to start doing the rounds on TikTok, because there are so many goth girls on that site who would love this.
Disintegration Girl's got to, surely.
This band, they need to get out of only fucking underground metal people who like In Solitude knowing about them and kind of get onto that circuit somehow, because it'll fucking work.
Absolutely.
Dance routine.
They normally do them in their fucking videos, don't they? There's a real beauty to this album that makes these songs feel like timeless. Like Lead Balloons is breathtaking. Like Matt's vocal line on that, when the band there, compared to the really tight claustrophobic parts, have this really like arrangement that's all about kind of opening up rather than holding that kind of tight.
Excuse the cliche, but it's got those soaring guitar lines, hasn't it?
It's when their main reference points, you obviously think about like 80s post-punk and stuff, but that kind of like shimmering light quality made me think of like things like the Cranberries, and like when you hear those old Cranberry songs like used in TV shows or whatever like that, it like these have that quality, and I don't know how many bands around are getting that right now, like period, like not just the kind of goth club dark wave thing, but 90s, indie, alternative, Brit rock, whatever you want to call it, it's tapping that kind of grace, and it's not just like a Deftones or a Hum part or whatever like all the American bands are doing. Even the way they use like dissonance and jagged sounds to their advantage melodically. Like I was saying, Conspiracy of Love has that riff that sounds like you're fucking hitting your funny bone on something. But the chorus and the harmonies in that song are so like clean and just perfect sounding. And like speaking of self-referential, I'm sure he says something about drops of beast milk in that as well. But like songs like that, and like you mentioned, When the Shooting's Done, that just have this amazing balance of like mood, pop, energy, atmosphere. It's somber and dramatic, but never flat or boring. And this record is now prettier than all of the shoegaze bands, as well as being catchier.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say it's not my favourite of the Grave Pleasures Beast Milk catalogue. It's way too early to say anyway. But I think it might have a shout for being the most dexterous and the most varied. And I think, like, after 6 years, as much as you want the thing that Grave Pleasures got so good at delivering, it's cool that you get that and so much more.
Yeah, I agree. Like, even when it's all out somber, like the last pair of tracks, Plagueboys and Tears on the Camera Lens, they're so well put together, like melodically and in the studio in terms of the sound of it, where even in a kind of subdued way, that title track gets its hooks in you kind of the second you hear that
Plagueboys, Empires Rise, Empires Fall, like this
living
is,
on the end of history.
Yeah,
that grand imagery they have of the obsessions with the end and kind of collapse that this band have, but like, hearing that song, I now view that very silly, garish album cover in a different kind of light, because I'm thinking about the kind of story of that track. And yeah, like, I agree with what you're saying, Elliot. Like, I love how on this record they've made it more immersive, but it still feels like alive too. Like, it still sounds like a real band with real fucking passion putting a record together in the same room as they should do. Even like you're saying, Sam, all of like the 80s post-punk stuff that's around, their influences feel like their own. It's all been translated through their own kind of way, like the best bands do. Like 80s post-punk and goth rock, there is cool now, and I'm going to need all of those people to get on this, even though it's probably just going to be fucking us again.
Maybe we'll see, but it's baffling that some of the things people love raving on about, that Grave Pleasures aren't one that are just like a name that everyone goes to for that, because like, they are the best at it, aren't they? Like, no one just does it as effortlessly as they do.
This is the sound of a band where they sound like they're writing songs that they want to hear and that don't already exist. Like, so many times you listen to something that's a bit generic and you think, what inspired you to do this other than just kind of wanting to chuck your hat in the ring? Whereas listening to this, it's like, yeah, I've never heard a song like Heart Like a Slaughterhouse before. Even though I say it evokes krautrock and new wave or whatever, I've not heard that. And if you have to wait 5 or 6 years for a bunch of genuinely original songs, I don't think that's too bad a trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, like, fuck it. The Paramore record was like dancey and full of post-punk nods and stuff like that, and still with a lot of introspection and melancholy on it. If you like that in the new Paramore record, and you've never heard Grave Pleasures before.
Paramore take Grave Pleasures out on tour. Like,
Mate, Hayley Williams, if she fucking heard this, would probably be in love with it. Like,
I think so, yeah.
the songs aren't even that much less accessible. Like, this record makes me feel how people who are like really hardcore into the Smiths must feel. Like that kind of jangle pop thing with a beautiful sense of like melody and melancholy. Like even when it's being miserable, I can't sit still when this is on. Like it's one of their most dour records. It's less immediately punk than their last ones, and it still like energizes me more than anything else I've heard this year. So Grave Pleasures, Plagueboys.